My name is Robert Boynton. I am the director of the Literary Reportage concentration here at the Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute at New York University. And I'm very happy to invite you here, to welcome you here to this event. This book, Two Sisters, is a fantastic book. I wrote a small piece about Åsne and the book in Esquire, if you want to get her backstory. And we're going to have a fantastic discussion here. I want to introduce Alana Breutman, the director of the New American Foundation, who is going to come up here. We're very happy to be doing this in collaboration with New American, and we've done events in the past, and I think we'll be doing more events in the future. So I hope you will come to them and get on their list. So, Alana Breutman.
Good evening. Don't be shy. Take some comfortable seats. We're really looking forward to the conversation. And Robert, thank you so much, and to all the colleagues at NYU for opening up your doors to such a beautiful space, and we love doing events with you. New America is thrilled to partner again with the Norwegian consulate, and welcome back Åsne Seierstad, who, though based in Oslo, is currently on a whirlwind book tour, taking her from Boston to San Francisco. We first hosted her 3 years ago for her bestseller, One of Us, about the Norwegian massacre carried out by Anders Breivik, which was named at the time one of the top 10 books of 2015 by the New York Times. And speaking with Åsne tonight is our own Bobby McKenzie, a senior fellow at New America and a director of our Muslim Diaspora Initiative. Bobby's a domestic and foreign policy analyst and scholar of the Middle East and North Africa. An anthropologist by training, McKenzie's an expert in displaced persons, refugee resettlement, and integration, so a perfect companion for this conversation. Two Sisters tells the story of two teenage Somali Norwegian sisters who in late 2013 left their family behind in Norway to join the Islamic State in Syria. It traces the sisters' journey, but also tells the parents' harrowing story as they attempt to bring the girls home and then struggle to accept that they may be gone forever. Tonight's conversation will touch on so many topics about the drivers of global jihadism, the realities of immigrant life in a liberal democracy, and the challenges to reporting on radicalization, whether from behind enemy lines or through anonymous chat rooms, as so much of this happens today. And we, of course, invite you to stay following the event for a glass of wine with Bobby and Åsne and to pick up a copy of the book from John over there. And now I'm so pleased to introduce Ms. Marit Hjelten, the Deputy Consul General of the Royal Norwegian Consulate. She does lead the cultural affairs of the oldest and largest Norwegian Consulate General in the United States and actively promotes Norwegian art and culture. And we're so pleased to be collaborating tonight and again in a month. So stay tuned for more of our events together. Marie, please.
So thank you, Elena, for those warm welcoming words. Of course, the Consulate General of Norway is pleased to support the launching of this incredible and gripping book, Two Sisters, here in the US. In Norway, Åsne Seierstad is not only known for being the author of several critical acclaimed books, she is also known for being fearless. And fearless she is. Having been in multiple war zones, covering bloodshed in various countries, Åsne Seierstad owns the word fearless. Seierstad started her career as a foreign news correspondent in Russia. Soon after, she covered the war in Chechnya, then the war in Kosovo, and she also reported home to Norway from Baghdad during the Iraq War in 2003. But Seierstad is also fearless in her writing, because she's someone who dares to start a conversation most would be afraid of. And she's telling personal stories with relevance to broad political situations of today. She has written multiple books and received critical acclaim for all of them. Her book from 2003, The Bookseller of Kabul, was on the New York Times bestseller list for 41 consecutive weeks. And she received various international awards for her book, One of Us. Two Sisters was the most sold book in Norway in 2017. And Seierstad was also awarded Brageprisen, a Norwegian Book Award, for that book. I hope you all enjoy the conversation today, and make sure to pick up a copy of the book before you leave. Signed, I think, is possible. And my warmest congratulations to you, Åsne, and thank you all for being here.
Good evening, everybody. I just want to clarify one thing. I've just been informed that the elevators will not be working unless everybody in here buys a copy of this book. Okay? So before you leave, you've got to pick up a copy of this book. But I'm excited to be here, and I've spent about 10 years now working in government at the Brookings Institution, setting up a center in Abu Dhabi looking at countering violent extremism. And governments, researchers, think tanks are seized by what are the drivers of violent extremism, what mobilizes folks to action. Syria has now in its 8th year of conflict has been an enormous engine of suffering. 500,000 dead, half the country displaced, 5 million Syrian refugees. And despite all of that, at least 30,000 foreign fighters have made their way to Syria. And what Åsne has done so beautifully is sketch out the stories of 2 girls and their family. And so if maybe you could just give us a sense of where the book starts. In October 2013, 2 girls, teenagers, one 19, one 16, vanish and off to travel to a place that is, as I mentioned, an engine of enormous suffering. So could you just maybe sketch out where the story begins and take us from there?
Yes, thank you, and thank you for the nice words at the beginning here. They don't just vanish. They just don't come back from school, and the parents are a bit afraid, because it's like they're usually always on time, and these girls are always behaving, and they're never doing anything wrong. They're like perfect girls. As the mother says, they even ask if they need to knock on the neighbor's door. So they do everything they should until they just deceive totally their parents and leave. And then the parents try to call them, they can't get no answer, and then at some point they receive an email in the early evening saying that, "Dear mom and dad, don't be sad, we have left for Syria, we're never coming back, we left to die, but it's actually for the benefit of all of us. We'll all, we're saving you all, because we'll, die as martyrs, and we can all get eternal life in paradise." So they have this very teenagey, light-headed way of looking at their hijra, their emigration to Syria. It's as if they don't really take it seriously.
I want to come back in a minute to what her father and mother and her siblings, her 2 brothers, thought about all this. But you mentioned in the beginning, or you just mentioned that this hijra was sort of something that they viewed almost in a naive way, but they certainly transformed, or the hijra transformed them rather quickly. And you and I were talking beforehand that within no time they were in the midst of some pretty grisly crimes.
Well, I think that these girls, they left quite early, autumn of 2013, so they were, if not the avant-garde of those foreign fighters going to Syria, they were of the first, among the first wave, especially among women. And at the time, there was a very rosy image of what would happen in Syria. And I think that many of these girls, they left believing that they were doing the right thing. Because what can be better than follow the path of God? And this was God's state on earth. This was going to be God's state on earth, and they were just, following. Of course, different people would have different experiences down there, but for a long time, they actually kept up the banner of ISIS, and they were becoming, as many of these women were, propaganda machines for the state, trying to get other sisters, other friends to come over. They even tried to get their family to come over. So they obviously believed in it for a long while, saying to their parents, like, you should hurry down here before everyone else comes. There's still some nice houses to get hold of. And these were also, many of the Europeans became like the elite of Raqqa because they came with money, like these girls. They had different ways gotten hold of quite a lot of money. So they were living a life in the villas of Syrians who had fled, who had been killed, different faith groups, and they were riding home to their families, bragging about the house, and they were even pets and everything they had, the cleaners and the hoovers, and so they were bragging about everything they got for free down in the caliphate, the true welfare state, as they called it.
And at any point, did their views change? I mean, obviously, we're talking about this very rosy view of things, but you mentioned in the book that the girls at one point were, almost with perverse pleasure, talking about the beheadings of Syrian farmers, the aid worker who was gruesomely murdered. And that's not the kind of picture that you were just describing, that they initially were telling their family about. So, I mean, they must, it must have been very clear pretty early on that they were in the midst of some pretty dangerous and bad things. But as we were talking about earlier, they didn't probably quite view it that way because you dehumanize the enemy, perhaps.
Well, it's not necessarily a contrast between those things. I mean, yes, there is obviously a contrast, but this is the way the ISIS women were talking. If you looked at the tweets, at the blogs, at the Facebook accounts at the time when these were still open, until a few years back, there's this joy, as you mentioned, of beheadings. They're just as bloodthirsty as the men, and they are. If we look at it's like looking at to demystify it a bit, looking at the Nazis. We have all these stories about, the guards or the architects of Auschwitz who would be the most loving fathers. You'd have the same here. It's not like they're necessarily evil or monsters in all aspects of life. On the opposite, they have these very cruel and evil or fascist, Islamo-fascist ideas. But on the other hand, they could be, loving friends or loving husbands or wives. So they're really reconstructing a society, and it's interesting how even the language they're having some of these European fighters in Raqqa having this new language, which is a bit of street slang. Like half of the guys going from Europe to Syria had a criminal record, 60% on an average, with drugs or theft or violence. So it's like they're bringing this street criminal slang mixed up with very pious talk, like verses from the Quran, so it's like they're just reconstructing several identities or reliving several identities merged into one that they tried to make a state out of.
And so her parents obviously must be just shocked by all of this. What are they communicating to her parents right away? And if you could maybe talk a little bit about what her father begins to do and also what happens with her mother and the actions that she takes, which are quite different.
Maybe I should just give a little bit of background of the family first. So this is a Somali family that came to Norway in the 90s. So the father came first. He was a child soldier in Somalia, and that's quite important for the story to understand his actions later. With what ease he was going to Syria to retrieve his girls was probably because he had lived war himself. So he came end of the 90s. He was fighting for the Somali liberation movement and was on the winning team. But what happens, as we know, after a civil war is over, the winning team is usually fighting for what there is to share. And then he realized that at the end of the 90s, this was no longer a war to die for. So he bought a passport. And in that passport, there was a stamp with a visa to Denmark. And then he heard it was better in Norway, so he came to Norway. And he was living in Norway for 2 years until he never got an asylum, but he got like a permit to stay and able to ship his family over from Somalia. And at the time, it was his wife and 3 kids that are the main characters in the story. Ayan and Leila, who was then 3 and 6, and the brother Ismail, who was 5. So this family all moves to Norway, and the kids are integrating quite well, at least on the surface. They're learning Norwegian, they're good at school, they're clever, they're good in sports, and they have a quite liberal upbringing, like they can go to the beach, they can swim, they dress as they like. And then something happens when the girls become teenagers. The mother, who's not integrated, who never learned Norwegian, who never had a job, who was living a life inside the house, and with her point of reference being her Somali girlfriends. So when the girls became teenagers, she was afraid of losing them because she saw they were wearing skinny jeans and T-shirts and going to parties, and she was afraid they would start drinking alcohol and get boyfriends. And then she did what she would have done in Somalia when there's problems in the family. She went to the local mosque. And this is like where there's the turning point in the story. And the mosque, the imam tells her there's this great Quran teacher, young, beautiful guy, 19 years old. He's very famous in this Somali community for bringing kids into Islam. And according to the father, that's when the nightmare begins. So this is the background story, and it's important to see where the conflict is, for us to learn from it too. Like in Somali culture, it's the mothers who bring up the children, and they are the least educated, the least integrated in work life, in other parts of kind of participation. So so that is part of it. When they leave, the mother is not blaming the Quran teacher as the father is. She's blaming the internet, because the internet you can always blame without being guilty yourself. Whereas the father is more like, that's the guy. So they actually, the whole family kind of explodes actually in different reasons and reasonings about why the girls left.
And so the father starts to make his way back and forth. How many trips did he make altogether? And just give us a sense of what that looked like, because there was a war going on.
Yeah, so he told them to come back over the phone that first evening after the email. And they said, no, we're on our way. Please don't look for us. And it took him only actually 2 more days before he also left first for Turkey and then down to Syria. And he was actually he found them. Which is quite amazing. If you go as a parent to Syria, very few did actually. Many of them were arrested. Many of them were accused of being spies. The only way to operate in Syria is like you have to join one of the militant groups. So through some smugglers and through some contacts he got in Turkey, he hooked up with a militant group which happened to be the Al-Nusra Front, which is the Syrian branch of Al-Qaeda. And they're the good guys in this story when it comes to trying to get out the girls. So they're actually trying to help him, because there's a slight difference at the time between Al-Nusra and ISIS is their view on women in a war. So ISIS wanted the women to be there right away because they needed to build the state and breed children, whereas Al-Nusra had the idea that first the war should be won and then the women can come. So he fights with them, or he spends time with them, and they give him a gun, and he travels around. And then as he finds the girls, there's a shooting between the Nusra front and ISIS. One of the girls are injured and sent off, and then the father meets the oldest sister, hugs her and thinks that, she's so happy to see him that finally they can go back to mommy and everything will be all right. And she says that I can't because I'm married and my life is now here. Yeah, the story, I'm not giving too much away because this is all in the first chapter. So he kind of, he holds her and doesn't want to let her go, and then he's taken off by ISIS soldiers and beaten up and tortured and put to prison and spends some time in an ISIS prison.
What do you think accounts for both of the daughters not wanting to return home and almost happily, staying where they are?
Well, it could be they had a good life in the beginning. I think I think it's also wrong to say that all these women going down there, girls going down there, and they're so shocked after one day. I think they actually, imagine this is the first time they do anything on their own. This is also a protest against the conservative, society. Well, not that their parents are so conservative, but these are not girls who've gone off ever to a weekend trip anywhere. This is adventure. This is fairy tale. It's love. They fall in love with these ISIS fighters. And again, it's also this, they move into these great villas. They move into the best houses in Raqqa. And there are kind of some kind of a European elite down there. And later when they got children, sending pictures of the children back to their parents, like every new picture, new outfits, baby bottles, like they didn't lack anything. And it was strange to see those pictures from the war zone, because on the other side you'd have Syrian children suffering immensely and tremendously and lacking in everything and being bombed. And then you had these ISIS women with their children who just could, send someone off to a day trip to Turkey and get everything they needed. So I think at the time, the first couple of years, I think they were actually supporting this state.
The information that was flowing back to Norway, could you give us a sense of how it was affecting two different communities? One, the Somali community, which is a small but sizable community. There are 30-some thousand, but also what were folks across Norway saying when they heard about, my God, we've taken in these refugees from Somalia, and now some are traveling to places like Syria. And because we are in an environment where both violent extremism and populism are natural allies, and both, feed off the other, certainly in the public sphere.
Well, I think, after all, these are small numbers, so it didn't really raise a debate on a general level. Hey, we're taking in all the Somalis and then they leave for the war zone. There are 100 foreign fighters from Norway, so it's small numbers. After all, some Somalis, from other backgrounds, there are also some converts. So it didn't really, it didn't really start a big debate whether there's, as a link between taking in refugees and radicalization. So luckily, because that could have been quite nasty. But no, it was more a debate of how come, what is happening, how big is this going to become? Because at some point, 2014, 15, the peak, you didn't really know how would this end, and how violent are they, and what do they learn in Syria, and what will they become?
And was there any, I just want to go back to this idea of this charismatic sheikh, or the imam at 19. Do we have any sense of how many people he may have energized? Did he energize people? I mean, obviously this is a complicated path where one decides to get on a plane to fly to Turkey and cross the border, but for the other 98 or so that did go, are there any common themes that sort of cut across their lives?
Well, I think one interesting part was to see how ordinary many of these young people were, and how you can go from a quite ordinary teenage life to an extremist, a bloodthirsty fundamentalist, like these girls became. And I think that, how is that possible? I think it's a step by step. It's small steps every day. So from one day to the next, it's not like you wake up and, oh, I want to go to Syria. But it's like, if all your steps go in the same direction, you might end up on the border to Syria. And in many of these young people's life, it started just with, well, looking for meaning, who am I? It's an identity, quest of identity. Where do I belong? Do I belong in this country? Do I belong rather in Islam and not in Norway? Can I have a foot in each culture? How is that? And those who left, they decided that, no, I need to choose. It's like, instead of being a second-class Norwegian, as many of them felt, because they would never become white-skinned, blonde skiers. They would always have dark skin. And for us who haven't had that experience, I think that's something to take into account. We don't really know how that is. And to be Somali, in addition, which is a very stigmatized group. But also it's a part of many of those who went, is like, is this sense of victimization, like, as a teenager, it's tough growing up for all of us. But if you can put all your, everything that doesn't go so well, you can put that in the same basket and say, it's because I'm a Muslim. That's why. That's why I'm failing. That's why I'm not feeling well. That's why I'm not accepted, and so on. So that is also part of it. And then they turn this over to to say that the Muslim, instead of being second-class Norwegian, I can be a first-class Muslim, and that is the point of reference, and it's becoming the only point of reference. And then for these two sisters, then Norway became like a prison to them. That's how they told, because they were not allowed to wear their niqabs in school. They were forced to have sports classes with the boys. Suddenly they sat on the bus and there was a guy sitting next to them. So they couldn't cleanse themselves enough from Norwegian culture or Western culture. And their way out, their liberation was to go to Syria, and this was also kind of a liberation movement somehow, feeling as a liberation movement from Norway into the paradise on earth that they were moving to.
When your book came out in Norway, what was the response among the wider public about these issues?
There was a great shock in Norway, actually, because of the book, because most people did not know. This is a parallel total society. Like, is this happening in our country? And how is it possible to choose to not live in the best country on earth, as Norway sees itself? And it's actually also known, this UN polls is like the happiest population. So how can you leave and choose and also the interesting, like coming from a war zone, these girls came from the war zone. And after only 13 years in Norway, they choose to go back to a war zone. And in Norway, it's interesting that many of those who went are first generation. In the UK and France and most of Europe is mainly second generation Muslims or even third generation. But in Norway, it's a lot of first generation. They come as kids. And also the guy that Ayan, the oldest girl, married, he came to Norway as a 13-year-old, as a minor asylum seeker, as an underage asylum seeker. And after 10 years in Norway, he moves back to the war zone. So there's definitely something that is not working for many of these youngsters.
Just to follow up on that and to put in perspective, the U.S. has 3.5 million Muslims, and we had something like 150 who attempted to travel. I think actually did travel to Syria. 250 were arrested altogether, but 150 actually made it. And if you compare the numbers, we've had very, very few from the U.S. But if you look around Europe, you've had certain neighborhoods in Paris and Brussels which produced far, far more foreign fighters than all of the U.S. Obviously integration is an issue. What should we take from this?
Well, I think there's several reasons for that difference. I think first of all, it's much easier to leave from, you just take a plane or a bus to Istanbul, and then you take the bus further down to the south and someone's going to help you over the border. And then we have very different Muslim populations, like in America, the Muslim population is above average, a bit above average when it comes to income and integration. In France, for instance, is a total underclass, filling up. You have the same percentage of Muslims in prison in France compared to the general population as you have blacks in prisons in the US. So the Muslims in France is definitely an underclass, as it is in most European countries. So it's like there's more anger. And also, I think there is a different it felt more like their cause. The Syrian conflict, it's closer, and from the U.S. it takes a bigger effort even to go. Yeah.
Okay. I have a bunch of questions, but I don't want to monopolize the time, and I see eager hands. I see people who are going to have eager hands. So let me open it up to the audience. If you could just state your name and your affiliation, and please keep it to questions so that Åsne can respond. We've got a microphone that's coming. So.
Hi, Janine DiGiovanni, the Council on Foreign Relations, and a very old friend of Åsne's. Methodology, how did you do it? How did you get into the story? Who did you interview? How long did it take? Just the tricks of the trade, so to speak.
It took me about 2.5, 3 years to work on the story. And it started out with the phone call from my publisher saying that she had heard about this Somali father who'd gone to look for his girls in Syria. And that he wanted a book written about that. And she asked me if I wanted to write the book, and I was like, no, I'm not interested. And then I was thinking, I had written a book about a family before, The Bookseller of Kabul, and it didn't go that well. I was sued, took 12 years of court proceedings after we finally won. So I was thinking, this is not going to work. Never write about a family again. So I was not interested. And then I kind of thought about it. It's interesting to try to find out what happens with these teenagers going from Europe. And I decided to meet the father, then the first thing I was thinking that this was not going to be pleasant. This was not going to be nice. This was not to be, something to rest in. We were never going to become friends. So when I met him, I was very much like, what do you want to achieve by writing a story? What are your motivations? I was kind of almost like a lawyer interrogating him. Because I knew this was going to be, I knew there was going to be conflicts. Because when it's such a big drama and such a big tragedy, it's difficult. So, but he had very good answers, and he said that why did he want a book written? That was because when the girls left, they hadn't understood anything, and then in hindsight, after a few months, they realized all the signs were there. So that the girls almost went through this textbook case of radicalization. And he wanted to warn others. So that was the start. And then I started with him. I sat for the first few months, I was just sitting with him, listening to him. And then the wife had then gone to Somalia with the two smaller boys to save them from Norway in order for them not to be radicalized. Because the other teenage son, he became an atheist. And the mother was like, if you grow up in Norway, you either become an extremist or an atheist. So it's just like saving the two little, primary school boys. So I had to go to Somalia and interview her there. And then it was, of course, that was the parents' side of it. I was going to Turkey with the Sadiq, where he showed me how he was managing around there. I was not going to the ISIS territory that he went to in Syria, but only in Turkey. And then the most difficult part was to find the milieu of the girls in Norway. That's a very closed off network of Salafi and Salafi jihadi young people, and it's very closed off. And the mosques are very closed off, and I just talked to, I think, hundreds of young girls who knew them. And social media helped a lot because they had not closed down their Twitter accounts or their Facebook accounts, so I could see who was following them and contacting everyone who followed them on Twitter. I could contact all their Facebook friends. And then these girls, they were part of this Salafi organization. They had left behind like phone lists and name lists. So it was a big material of people that I could just actually call. Even if 90% of them would not answer, there would always be, or 95, maybe 97, there will always be one or two, a couple of, who would answer. So it was a big work to just like find out what kind of life they had lived. And then there was a great challenge with the father, because the father is he's a great storyteller, sometimes too great. So, and it took me a long time to realize that he was also inventing stuff. And the big lie, the main lie was that when I met him, he said that his girls, yes, they'd gone voluntarily, but then they had been kidnapped down there. And they were hiding from ISIS, they had fled from their husbands, and he was going down there to rescue them. And I believed it, because of course you'd flee from an ISIS husband. Of course you'd want to go home. And only after 1.5 years, I realized that this was a big lie. And that was when I got this long chat log between the two sisters and their brother, where I realized that they'd never wanted to come back. They had never been in hiding. They never fled from their husbands. And then I didn't confront him right away. I had to gather all inconsistencies in the story. And then when I confronted him with all those things that were not accurate, he just left, and we didn't speak for 6 months. So there comes in the fact that that I didn't lose a friend. This is a working relationship, and I think that's very important. And then in order to get back together, there were people mediating between us, and because I told him, you have no credibility. If you want me to write what you're telling me now, you have no credibility in Norway, nor have I. So he said, he wanted me to retrieve my words. And it's like, no, because I mean it. So it's like, in the end, we worked We were back in working, and I told him, like, we need to have second sources on everything that's in the book. And everything that's not second sources of, we can't put it down. There are some parts of the book where he is telling the story, like his story in his own words. But when I'm recounting the story, it's based on that I have several sources on it. So it's been a big puzzle when it comes to several layers of storytelling and truths, and a big puzzle of just finding the information.
Do you think that the big lie, was just his deep embarrassment that he failed as a father, as a man, as a community leader, and didn't want to own up to that, or was he telling all kinds of lies?
No, I think that's probably the main reason. And also in the book, actually, how to write in a book that someone is lying without making him into someone who's like, oh, he's a shitty liar. Why, it's in Norway, to lie, it's a big thing. We don't understand that people are lying. It's like, but why did you say that? That's not true. It's like it's a culture where we're very like how to say, quite straightforward. Not always, but most Norwegian public, they wouldn't really get it. So I had how to write it in the way that people accept his lies, without denouncing him as a person. And I realized the only way is like if the reader is with him. If the reader feels his desperation, if the reader is desperate with him and kind of, yes, of course he has to lie because it's such a fall of status. You have not one child who's deceived you, but you have two, your only daughters have left you. You didn't control them, and it's obvious that you have to tell people that they're kidnapped. So I think that's the only way. So he has approved of the story. He's read it, and he's like, it's okay.
Other questions? Right here in the front.
Thank you. Hi. Such an interesting story. I'm so curious how the girls ended up living such a fantastic life there as elites, because I think in America, when we think about people going to Syria, they join the army, they live in the desert, they learn how to fight, to shoot a gun. And I'm just trying to understand how it is that they ended up as elites with everything they could possibly want. Did their parents send them money, or how does that work? Why were they so special?
Well, the parents did not send them money. They were, many of the young Europeans going, they were abusing different systems of credits. So taking up loans. They were taking up, they were getting a youth loan in a bank. They would buy mobile phones, like buy a mobile phone for $1 with a subscription, and then you sell the whole thing to someone. And no one's going to pay the rent, pay the bill because they leave for Syria. Or they would take up loans for buying a car. So they were actually leaving with stacks of money. And, well, the word of fantastic is their own words, definitely. And I think different women have different experiences. None of the women were really fighting with ISIS. Some were parts of a police force. But most of them went there to become housewives and facilitating the life of the fighters. It seemed to me that most of these girls knew what they would go there for, to become wives and housewives. And that these girls, they were so religious that they would rather not leave the house in Norway. So they had a life of spending time with their girlfriends when their husbands were out fighting. And for a while, it seemed, at least that's what they wrote home about and talked about among themselves, it seems like this was the life they wanted. But of course, a stolen house is not a safe house. So eventually they had to flee from Raqqa, which they did last summer. with their babies and kids, and where they are now, we don't know. I mean the parents, I don't know. We haven't heard from them since last fall. They might be dead. There's a lot of bombing in that area. There's a little strip of land between the Syria and Iraq that's still held by ISIS. There's a few pockets here and there. They might be in the desert. They might be in some Iraqi refugee camp, and those Iraqi refugee camp are run by, well, part of the militants. I heard there was 30 women now on death row, European women. So it's not that it's not a UN refugee camp. It's a prison. They might be there. It's like nobody knows where they are. But as a Somali girl, you can't really blend in with the Syrian population. So now life must be, I assume, it's hell for them now if they're still alive. But for a while, this was they had internet, they had goods, they had money, and they thought they were doing the right thing.
Do you know what the policy is in Norway for foreign fighters who want to return home?
Well, it's a crime to join a terror organization such as ISIS, so they would be arrested if they came home. They would probably not get a long sentence. There's only a few guys who have come back, actually, and they gotten 6-7 years on an average. These girls would probably get less because they haven't really fought.
Okay. Other questions? The gentleman here.
You talked about ISIS creating meaning and giving meaning to these girls. What do you think the West could learn from ISIS about creating meaning in the West for young people, for immigrants?
That's a difficult question. Well, I'll have to think about it. But at least they created a cause for these young people believing that they were important. Because one of the, some of the best sources for this book were those who had wanting to go to Syria, who were on the verge of going, maybe even planning to go with the sisters or with some brothers, but who, for different reasons, did not go. They would tell about this, they would be able to tell about the feel of how it was. And what they said about those guys, especially who went, was like, in common for them was like they were leading life without directions. They were leading lives, kind of meaningless lives, on the street, a bit of crime, a bit of that, and suddenly Islam gives them a framework, structure, something to believe in, and something to make them feel important, and justifying them becoming soldiers and becoming powerful. So I think that that having a cause, important cause, and feeling important, that I think is something that, yes, European societies has not really helped those who had fallen outside the society. For the two girls, I think they had lives with quite a lot of meaning, but I think that this was something they found themselves. For the first time, this was their thing, their cause. So I think that's probably the more than having, because meaning it's a bit too broad or vast. But they are discussing this a lot with their brother on these chat logs that I got hold of. It's a lot about meaning of life, truth, seeking truth. They're very much like looking for something down there.
Just to follow up on that question, 100 went to Syria, but 100 is still a fraction. What was the wider Muslim community saying about those who had left? Their own brother became an atheist, I think in part because of all that had happened. Was the wider community saying, what the hell is going on? Were they worried about more kids going, or did they view this as really a set of outliers who just didn't fit in.
Yeah, that's important to know that this is a very tiny minority, and they have very little support, but it's of course those who become violent, that is a fraction, but there is the Salafi movement of withdrawal that is much bigger than those 100. And when you look at radicalization, you can look at it as a ladder or a stair, where the first step is like, putting yourself outside of the group and saying we are different from the majority. And we are suppressed and we need to hit back, and it's like so only the last step is violence, but you have lots of Salafi organizations who are leading these teenagers almost all the way except from the violent part, and then they have to do that last jump. They don't need to go to Syria to do that, because the road to Syria is kind of closed now, or it lost its it's not a shining path any longer to join the losing team of ISIS. But of course now all European governments are wondering about, now that they don't have this way out. Radicalization is continuing, but they're staying at home, and what is happening there. But that is it's yet to be seen.
Other questions? Maybe right here in the front.
So I'm an admitted student here for next year, and this question is more about your overall work than this work. You have done so many projects and they require so much work, and your output is so high. I was wondering how you use your time to manage this, just in a very concrete way.
Well, how do I use my time? I think I'm very... can you be more specific? What do you want? Like, what do you want to know?
How do you? So many different writers have different ways of approaching their work, like from the hours they do it to just throwing themselves in for months at a time and then stepping back. How do you get so much done?
Okay, I don't know. I think I see myself as a lousy planner, actually. I think I'm very I probably follow my instinct a lot, but of course, in a book like that, which is what is difficult, I found, is like, okay, when to do the research on the background, when to do the girls, when to do the family. So it's like, sometimes it's easy to get paralyzed by there's so many things you need to do, and to do one after the other properly. But I think I'm just I'm working. I'm using my working hours to work, and whether talking to a lot of people. Sometimes it's doesn't feel that helpful or engaging even, but sometimes you need the numbers of people thinking the same way. When I interviewed all these young girls, the friends of the girls, it's interesting that they're very repetitive, many of them. Okay, so they actually do have those opinions or do mean this. So so I'm dividing it between gathering material, like the interviewings and the reading and other research, and then the writing. This book actually was quite easy to write. Like my former book about Anders Breivik and the massacre in Norway, that was a very, very difficult book to write that paralyzed me, because it was like going into an ongoing tragedy. So I was gathering and never got to start writing. And I was just that material just paralyzed me. In this book, as I was fooled to think that those girls were kidnapped and were soon to be rescued, I was thinking, okay, I'll work really quickly with a background story. I'll gather all the material I can so that when the girls are rescued, I'll be there on the border with Sadiq. I'll interview them really quickly. before the tabloids take them and before they're put in prison. So I was like working as if they were soon to come back. And that is a good thing, because then I was working quickly, writing at the same time. So I didn't have as much respect for the material as I had with the massacre on the island in Norway. So I think that's always good if you're able to start writing while you're researching. It's really, it helps. It just speeds up the process a lot.
Right there.
Hi, I was wondering, when we have a book like this where you get insight into a family's life, it's easy to sympathize with that. But on a day-to-day, when you just see news alerts and then you feel in that moment sympathy or empathy for what's happening, and then you just kind of slip into complacency about it until the next news alert hits you and you're like, wow, people are actually dying as I read this. Do you think there's any way to combat that kind of complacency that slips in between two incidents where we're like, okay, we know something's happening, but you can't connect to it simply because you feel like there's nothing you can do? So I guess in two parts, how do you combat that sense of complacency or the fact that you just forget about it? And secondly, what can we do as just people ingesting this news, feeling kind of helpless about the situation since we can't physically maybe go there, but how do you think we can play a part in kind of helping, or can we even help?
I think different stories open different rooms in you as a writer. For instance, the last book, the Massacre in Norway, I had to bring some of these teenagers back to life that were killed by Anders Breivik, the neo-Nazi right-wing terrorist. And I lived with those teenagers so closely, like after they were dead, I had to go back and, to their birth and their, toddling years. And that was really a very painful process. But when it comes to these two girls, to be honest, I don't feel anything for them. And I thought it was an interesting experience because I thought you had to feel for the people you wrote about to write something interesting. And then I actually, even though I personally don't feel anything for these two girls, I realized it's actually the reader does feel for them anyway. I mean, again, maybe most, well, sometimes I wanted to slap these two girls and think like, oh, grow up, things like that. But I never had like any strong feelings for them. I still don't even know how I would react if I hear that they were bombed. They are not the victims in Syria. I feel that very strongly. They are part of the, the aggressor. They're part of the, just like you would say that the guards in Auschwitz. That's the team they joined. So it's like it's possible to write something engaging even though you are quite cold about the people you write about as a writer. I'm more interested in them than I am actually feeling for them. So what we can do, I think that to understand something, we need to get to know. And my mission is being a storyteller. I'm not there to explain, I'm not there to explain why they left, but I'm going to just lay open, these are the factors. This is what happened to them and others. Like just telling what happened and also telling what happened in Syria on the ground. So that's at least what I can do, is to tell the story.
Right. The lady in the front. Thank you very much for coming to share. 1 second, we've got a microphone.
Thank you very much for coming to share this fascinating story. Just listening to you closely and talking about what happened in the family and these two girls, to me, I'm left with the conclusion that the capacity, the human capacity for self-delusion is enormous. Could you please comment?
Yes, and Sadiq, the father, is a living example of that. And that is what makes him to this very interesting character. If he'd just been the father who gone down heroically to save his daughters and being grief-struck when they didn't want to come home, he would have been a much flatter character. But then he's just inventing all those stories. He can't live with the fact that the daughters left him and didn't want to come home with him. So he's kind of going crazy towards the end of the book. But not as crazy as I couldn't write about it. It's like I had to find out, how serious is this? Is he psychotic? Or is it just like this is human desperation? Like what happens? Like the other book that I mentioned, I spend a lot of time with the parents who've lost their teenagers by, a stroke of, a bullet. Like they're dead from talking to them on the phone in the morning, in the afternoon, they're dead. They go straight into grieving, shock and grieving. But these parents, Sadiq and Sarah, they have also lost their teenagers. But they can't really grieve because they're not dead. And they're not victims either. They're left by themselves. So there's so many conflictuous emotions. And also for the mother, that when I told her, when we talked about the Quran teacher and his role, she said she went to see the Quran teacher afterwards and told him, like, people say that you radicalized my girls. And he said, no, that wasn't me. So she said, so then it wasn't him then. Then it was the internet. So she was very happy to take off the blame off him, because that would take off her blame too. And just like, it's probably some force out there. So yes, that is, it's probably a story and a self-delusion, looking at the girls. Like, that's what I really wonder about now. Because these two girls were quite tough in their early teens. Are they back at who they were in their early teens, now thinking, why did I leave Norway for this? This hell? I want to come back? Or are they still in this state of, the more we suffer, the better place we get in paradise, the better position we'll get, dying as martyrs. So it's like, are they being self-delusional or too? So it's like, definitely part of the book.
Given the policy that everybody in the room has to buy a book and that we only have 15 minutes left, we're going to have to wrap it up here to give each of you time to buy a book and get it signed. Just one final question for you. And you mentioned that, as we talked about earlier beforehand, at the beginning of the conflict, Norway had an open door for people to leave, and Syria had an open door for people to enter. That has changed, but you mentioned tonight that those doors are no longer open, but that doesn't change the fact that you have Salafi networks, you have violent extremism on the rise, even if it's in really small numbers, but the impact of any of those actions is enormous. What do you hope that governments, not only across Europe, but particularly in Norway, do to address these issues? Because, I mean, the impact is far beyond just the loss of life.
Well, in Norway, actually, a lot has been done. And, of course, it's easier to operate Norway than it is to operate France or Britain when it comes to the immigrant populations and those networks. Like in Norway, no one has gone to Syria since 2016, since actually end of 2015. It's a very transparent society. It's so what's happened there is like the police and the security police, they are surveilling these networks. Many of those networks are criminal, so they have really targeted them on crimes that are easier to, like theft or whitewashing of money. So they go after the other crimes they do, and they split them up. So that main jihadi Salafi network is down with a broken spine. It almost doesn't exist. And then, of course, how to get young people for not to be fascinated by those old leaders. That is important. So it's important that there's this information pool that is working well in Norway between the police, the security police, youth workers, schools. So schools today are those who report most cases of radicalization, but not forget the families and the mosques. But the families are maybe the key factors here. So the police is like each district have like their officer working with kids and youth and so on. So if there's some worrying signs, let's say heard by the schools, they would go home to the parents and speak to them. And that is how actually averted a lot of those kids going, because these kids might have lost respect for Norway and, you know, their teachers and everything, but they might still respect their father. When parents who have not been aware of what's happening, if they are able, and there were several of those cases in the book too, a mother who just like sees, there's something happening to my daughter, let me check. So the parents who are active, have been able to, that girl is now studying instead of being in Syria. She was going to go with the two sisters. So it's like there is a lot of that that's been done in Norway, and that is being done in the Netherlands and in France. But of course, in France, these networks are so strong and there are so many. So there's no way that you can actually surveil it in that way. But that is the method that has been proven to be working, is that you have this, you know, circle of information and focusing on, you know, social workers and youth workers, not only the police. And I would like, if this is the, you know, final question, I think that the main protection against radicalization is to create good societies, is to create a society where people feel that they belong, is to create strong bonds between, you know, children of different faiths and cultures and backgrounds. One arena in Norway that we all go to is the schools. We only have public schools in Norway, hardly. We don't have any Muslim schools or Christian schools. So it's like that's really an arena to work on where everyone meets. So it's yeah, not only for work on the police part of it, but also to work on what create bonds that might have fewer people wanting to, you know, protest or react, reject.
Well, thank you very much for joining us tonight, and thank you very much for producing a brilliant book that is beautifully written. So please join me.
Thank you for coming.